The province's newest medical school has found itself facing scrutiny from the Premier's office. It has to do with TMU's decision to reserve 3/4 of the 94 possible spots for medical students from underrepresented groups. Well, applications started rolling in last month, and it was around the time that we spoke with Dr. Dominic Shelton, who is the school's Assistant Dean of Admissions and Recruitment. And we also spoke to him about prioritizing diverse applicants.
We also want to look at what else they bring to being a physician and what how they will serve their patients of the future, and that will be informed by their other experiences in life and like I said, life's journey. And so because that is going to be important to where they decide to practice and how they will deliver care in the future.
That is Dr. Dominic Shelton, who is the Assistant Dean of Admissions and Recruitment at the new TMU Medical School. Premier Ford says that school must ensure that qualified individuals fill the seats regardless of their race or background. Rekha Verma sees nuance in all of this. She is a principal consultant at Diversity and Beyond and is in studio with us now. Rekha, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
I'm very glad to have you here. We are in some ways simplifying or attempting to simplify something that is complicated. But what do you make of not just the decision by TMU to reserve the majority of its spots for students from diverse backgrounds, but the Premier coming out and saying, look, those people have to be qualified?
You know, David, I understand some of the concerns that are voiced by the Premier's office. And if I didn't know the context in which our healthcare operates, I would have said, I would have agreed with some of those concerns. I may have been one of the people who is saying, yes, it should be meritocracy-based. It should have been, it should be irrespective of race or where these folks are being recruited from. But my work in this area, and I work in the equity space, particularly in the healthcare space. And I have insight into the outcomes of the healthcare system. So, if you look at healthcare systems across the world, we know Canadian healthcare system is one of the best in the world because it's rooted into social justice. Mm-hmm. And because of that, that makes it harder for us to critically evaluate or criticize a healthcare system. I'm sure when you go to, I'm sure you have a family physician. I am sure when you go to the hospital, you complain or report about some of your symptoms, you're trusted, you're believed, you're seen. And in most of the cases, at least 9 out of 10, the doctors or the treating physician would treat you, and you'll be satisfied with the way you receive treatment.
But that's not the case for everybody.
But that's not the case for everyone, right? And as per Stats Canada data, there are communities that do not have access to healthcare services. And when they eventually get to the healthcare or do get to the family physician, either they're untreated or undertreated, or the satisfaction is not what it is for many of the other Canadians.
Is the solution to that making sure that new doctors come from underrepresented communities?
So that is one of the approaches, right? So our system has worked for many people. It hasn't worked for a few marginalized, underserved community. And one of the approaches or one of the solution is that to have medical students from those underserved communities get trained and then, have an avenue or have an opportunity to go back and serve those very communities that are underserved at this point in time, which is where TMU's approach comes in. And if you look at, and the pushback really is, if you look at the wording of the Premier's office pushback, it seems to stoke that zero-sum mindset that if there are 3-4 seats reserved for students coming from underserved community, that it's going to take away from a pool of deserving candidates somewhere else. But these are not part of 2,900 number of medical students doctors that are produced in Canada every year. These are additional seats. And of that, 3/4 are reserved for students, medical students from underserved communities.
I think one of the contentions, or one of the because the Premier's not the only one talking about this. He's in many ways responding to others who were talking about this or writing about this. But he has a big pulpit from which he stands. The question is about the GPA. So TMU has set a minimum GPA around the B+ area, and the contention is that setting things too low? Now, I will say, just to head things off, TMU is saying, well, it is either equivalent or higher than it is for 3 other medical schools in this province right now.
So there are a couple of things here in terms of, I think there are three factors to be considered here. One is the selection criteria, which includes MCAT as well as GPA. There are 7 other universities that do not include or do not use MCAT in their selection criteria, right? TMU being one of those.
Because they have argued the MCAT doesn't predict who's going to become a great doctor.
That's true. It's not a solid predictor of who will make a good physician.
But
or
you do need a measure.
We do need a measure.
When you get buried with
right.
applications, you need some way of separating people, right?
That's right. And so GPA is another one. But if you look at the other 3, they've also, it's not 3.3 in many cases. Some are actually 3, or the median is around 3. But the third measure is really about the extracurricular, right? What is it that students have done in their undergrad or in their high school, which would indicate that they're likely to be good physician. It could be, in some cases, could be robotics, could be computing. It could be specific areas related to healthcare, which would show that they're interested, they are committed to it. But try to imagine communities that are underserved, or they are in areas which do not have the kind of health services we have in Toronto, where we are broadcasting this from. And how would you expect an undergrad student or a high schooler in those communities to be able to have those extracurricular activities? They just don't have the avenue. Or try to imagine, an undergrad or a student who's aspiring to be a medical student, but who comes from a war-torn area and is now just doing 2 jobs in addition to their studies. And so it's complex. If we want to have students from underserved community, or if we want to address that gap, it has to be on factors beyond GPA. Of course, you need GPA. You need a bare minimum GPA. You do need bare minimum academics or, studies excellence, but you also need factors other than that in terms of cultural competency. You do need to know that, that folks have a story which is very compelling in terms of why they want to serve the community in terms of healthcare space. Yeah,
we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI. It has become almost a bad word in some quarters. This is a remarkable transition from where it was 4 years ago, when it seemed like in the post-George Floyd era that companies galore were hiring people on in DEI positions. There's a significant shift, and in part because some people think either DEI doesn't work or that it is unfair. Where you work in this space. I mean, do you still use the term DEI?
I think the term is beginning to be associated with. So there's a lot of baggage now that has been associated with the term DEI.
Baggage is a good way to put it.
But David, I think what is more important for me is for me this issue of gap in the healthcare, particularly for underserved community, is actually a human rights issue. It's a basic human right of every Canadian and PR holder to have access to equitable health. It is not the case right now, right? So it is, whether we call it DEI, whether we call it equity, whether we call it anti-racism, I think it goes back to making sure that the experiences for everyone is equitable. Now, try to imagine, someone from the Native community who does not speak either English or French, 2 of our official languages, right? When they go to the hospital, it's almost like, for your listeners, it would be like going to Japan or Korea when you do not speak Japanese or Korean, and you're trying to get treated for, you're trying to secure some treatment for yourself or your family. That is how difficult it could be for members of many Native and Indigenous communities out here. Or for that matter, many underserved communities or racialized underserved communities, right? So it goes
and
back.
that happens every day in the GTA.
And it's happening every day. It's happening to such an extent. Like, we sometimes complain about long waiting times when we go to hospitals. But the waiting times or the experiences of some communities is so far removed from what we can imagine that it has translated into a shorter lifespan. There are many of these underserved communities that live up to 10 or 11 years shorter lives than an average Canadian. And this is all as per StatsCan data. So for me, it is, whether we call it DEI or not, I think the reason why these initiatives have been introduced is more important, because they're addressing a gap, and that gap is not just about superficial level. That gap actually has an impact on how well people live, how long people live.
All right. Rekha, thank you so much for coming in today. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
That is Rekha Verma, who's principal consultant at Diversity and Beyond. Here's Jennifer.